Okay guys, so it hasn't been done yet, but we're going to give it a try today in this video. An SI rear suspension swap on an FL2 Honda Civic Hatchback. So before I jump right into the install, I want to get a little bit of preliminary info to share with you guys to get some before and afters of various aspects. So the first thing I'm going to do is get the car and my race skills here. I use those a lot for the S2000, get corner balance. We're going to use them to get a preliminary baseline on where the corner weights are in the car and how much weight is over the rear tires from the factory. So the SI's curb weight is 2952. And multiply that by 0.394, which is 39.4% rear weight they list online on the Honda manufacturer's website. So the SI has 1,163 pounds over the rear tires. We're going to see how this compares in stock form to see if it's going to be kind of set up the same weight distribution wise. Scale zeroed out here. Just a quick look at the setup. Pull it up on the ramps, get you some numbers. Civic is up on the scales. Let's go take a look at what our numbers are here. The car does have 3/4 tank of gas right now, so almost a full tank. 2931 total weight, so about 21 pounds. Now it's 2930. It's bouncing around a little bit, but about 22 pounds lighter than the SI. Rear weight is about 40.1% and 1175 on the rear. This car's exact numbers are coming out about 10 pounds heavier, 12-ish pounds heavier on the rear than the SI, and there is less weight up front. There's 59.9% front weight, 40.1% rear weight. So that's interesting to me because the hatch is 5 inches shorter than the SI in the rear, so you have a lot less steel hanging off the rear. However, you have a much larger piece of glass that extends further to the back of the car than the SI. And the other thing you get in this car that the SI doesn't have is you get a spare tire. All right, so just for the hell of it, took out the spare. Now it's equivalent to the SI. If you get a flat tire, you're kind of screwed. The SI just comes with a can of Fix-A-Flat and an air pump. So, as you can see, nothing else is taken out of the car. 3/4 tank of gas. And now we are down at 2893. So rear weight is now 1133, which is about 30 pounds lighter than the SI, because we just took 30 pounds directly out of the trunk. So yeah, this is the lightest 11th gen Civic you can buy. The 2.0 liter with a 6-speed manual, no sunroof. It's so close to the SI in rear weight that swapping the SI rear springs and dampers onto this car will behave the same on the rear end of this car as it would on an SI. It's seeing the same loads and everything. Same wheelbase on the car and the same loads on the rear tires. So I think it's going to be a pretty successful swap. The second thing I want to check is actual ride height from the floor to the painted fender from the ground, the OEM suspension. We're looking at 26 and 9/16 on the rear. All right, so the third thing is I'm going to check the toe, which is the total toe in the rear, so I can see if my alignment changed before and after the suspension swap. All right, so we're looking at 4/32 total toe in the rear. The fourth and final thing I wanted to do is just get an idea of how much the rear suspension compresses when I sit in the trunk. So I'm going to go ahead and sit in the trunk. We can get an idea here how much the suspension drops. I'm learning as I go here. Don't be like me. I just found out by tearing apart the interior to get to this location that the top hats of the struts are not accessible through the inside of the car like they were on my 8th gen SI. Here are the SI rear springs and dampers. These are from a 2022 Civic Si that had about 1,000 miles on it. The guy swapped out the suspension for coilover, so I just grabbed his rear suspension. Honda actually did a nice job with the design in this, because if you pull this boot down a little bit and you look up, there is what looks to be a 12mm head bolt carrying the shock to the frame of the car from underneath the car. So I just wasted a lot of time going and taking apart the interior when I didn't even need to for this rear suspension change. This is actually a lot easier than I thought, so hopefully I saved you guys some time. This is the point of the video where I got to throw some gloves on, because I undercoated this whole car with Blaster Surface Shield before last winter, and it just makes an absolute mess to work on, but it saves everything underneath from rust driving in these salty New York winters. But it's a sticky, waxy substance that all the dirt clings to, so it makes it kind of a pain to work on your car. So it is a 12mm head up there. Go ahead, loosen these bolts. Once you get those top 2 bolts out, there's only one other bolt to take out the bottom of the strut. Just one 17mm bolt behind the shock right here. All right, so the OEM shock is out. This is what the top hat looks like. Gonna have to pop that off and swap that over to the SI strut. The only thing I'm struggling with now is I can't push this down far enough to get that spring out. So ideally you'd want to loosen all the rubber bushings to the car. However, that will definitely mess up your alignment. So there's an eccentric bolt back there that connects the lower control arm to the frame. That really is the toe adjustment eccentric back there. So if I loosen that and tighten it, I'll probably never get this back to where it was. You know, I could always get it realigned afterwards. I'm trying to see if I can do this without changing the alignment on the car, but to give it a little less resistance, I'm going to unbolt this top control arm from the knuckle and see if I can push down hard enough on this to remove the spring. Alright, so with that disconnected, you might just have enough room. Doing a lot of twist on the trailing arm bushing and the lower control arm bushings here. So guys, a little bit of a rookie move. I'm trying to push down on this control arm and I got the sway bar fighting me. So I'm going to pull out this 12mm bolt here, take that end link off, disconnect the sway bar, and try again. Alright, with that sway bar link disconnected, here's a look at the springs. The one on the right is from the SI, the one on the left is from the Sport. This is what I kind of expected. This is a shorter overall length to start with, however, it is over 50% stiffer than this spring over here. I believe this is 320 pounds per inch. This is like 156 pounds per inch, so a significant difference there. However, roughly an inch shorter overall length, uncompressed. This plastic cover just pops right off the top of the OEM strut here, and there is probably, looks like a 14mm hex and an Allen key. So you're going to stick your Allen wrench in and use your wrench to take this one nut off, and then we can swap this over to the SI shock. So I broke the nut loose with an impact, but it's a little tricky because it's nested inside this little cavity, so you can't get like a flat wrench on it and fully engage on the nut. Make sure not to strip this out. So I knocked it loose with an impact, and then I'm just finishing it off with a wrench here. Once you got the nut off, looks like there's a washer underneath. Of course, you got to take this boot off as well. Get the boot off. I'm going to use a little bit of a plastic tool here, work it around. There we go. Now this piece is just kind of nested in the bump stop. There you go, the top hat's off. I believe I need to swap over my bump stop and my top hat to the SI shock that I purchased. The springs are much shorter for the SI, but the struts themselves seem to be about the same exact height. That's the part number on the SI strut right there, the T22. One thing I wanted to note is the part number for the bottom here, this rubber standoff, and the top piece is the exact same part number as the one that's on the Sport. So these happen to come with the spring that I purchased. He was able to include them, so I'm just gonna leave them on there and throw them back in the car, but the nubs and everything, the spacing between these is the same as the Sport ones, so this should drop right in, no problem. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the bump stop nested back in the top hat here. Slip this on, put the nut back on the SI shock. Tighten it up. Make sure you seat your boot nicely into the top hat, and this unit is ready to go back in the car. Don't forget to put your plastic cap back over the top of the top hat. I'm only reminding you because I just forgot to and put this back in the car and had to take it out twice now. Should be easier to get back in because the spring is shorter to start with. I sprayed a little white lithium grease on the mating surfaces to the car just to prevent any possible squeaking from rubber on metal. Much easier to get the SI parts in. Make sure your two little nubbies on the bottom here and here are through those two holes. Ensures the spring is seated properly and in the right orientation. Now I'm going to be going ahead and installing the strut back in the car. So label side out, I believe, towards the outside of the car. Make sure you get this started before you get the spring in its final position. All right, so it's all back together. Make sure to reconnect your sway bar when you're done. Repeat this process on the other side of the car. It's the same exact process. Make sure to jack up your wheel to the correct ride height from, I usually measure from the center of the hub to the fender to get that measurement. Then put a jack underneath the rotor. Don't crush the dust shield, put it underneath the rotor surface here. Jack it up, measure, and then you can tighten the bolt for your upper control arm here. I'm gonna actually try the other side without removing this bolt. The reason you want to tighten it when it's at the proper ride height is to clock the bushing at its neutral position so it's not twisted when the car's sitting still at its static ride height. Yeah, pretty excited about how that came out. Everything seems to fit in there. The only thing I will say is looking on these parts online, just about every control arm on this car is a different part number than the SI. So that made me a little nervous because I wasn't sure if the design of the parts was actually different. They're for geometry, and if these parts would work or not. Everything seems to bolt up no problem. I'm pretty sure the only difference and the reason that they're different part numbers on the SI is the bushings pressed into them are a stiffer rubber, I believe. They use similar bushings to the Type R as a little bit stiffer of a rubber, so there's less deflection when you corner. However, I think the biggest enhancement to the sport suspension here will be the springs and dampers. I'm not going to get crazy and try to swap out control arms. That's a lot more expensive, but this should probably get you 90% as good a handling as an SI would from the factory. All right, I got the driver's side done. I was able to get it done about 5 times faster than this side I showed you, just because I know what I was doing this time. I ended up not removing the upper control arm here to get this side done. I really had to put a lot of force stepping on this, but as long as you disconnect the sway bar, you have just enough room where you can slip the OEM spring out, and then getting the SI spring in, of course, like I said, is easier because it's an inch shorter uncompressed. So everything's tight now. Really, really easy install. I was actually pretty surprised how easy it was to swap those out. Much easier than the 8th gen, being that you can get to all the bolts without removing the interior like I did earlier. But yeah, let's get this thing lowered back down, check ride height, check the alignment, and I'll give you guys some initial driving impressions. So rechecking the alignment, looks like we're at 4/32 or 1/8 inch toe in still. So all these mods did not alter the alignment at all. So that's a great cost savings too, because that's over $100 if you needed to get the rear end aligned. So the car's been sitting now for about an hour. Go ahead and check the ride height. It's coming in at 26 and 11/16, so about an 1/8 inch increase. However, that's okay because I think this might settle some more after a couple weeks or something. And I do plan to install a rear hitch, which is going to add, about 30 pounds to the very end of the car. So that may settle a little bit more and be almost identical to the OEM setup. So it's been about 6 to 7 weeks now since I did the suspension swap. And I've also in that time installed the Kurt rear hitch and did all the trailer wiring. So I have the extra weight on the rear of the car now that it's going to be for the rest of its life as a daily driver for me. But let's recheck the rear ride height now after this long. It's settled, it's had plenty of time to settle, and I've added some rear weight. So we're looking at 26 and 9/16 to the painted fender on the ride height. So guys, I'll be honest, I couldn't be happier with how this turned out. The ride height is identical to how this car came from the factory, so it's not going to look goofy to change how the rear rides compared to the front, since I did not change the front struts. But yeah, so I'd highly recommend this setup. Again, like I said, I have a rear hitch installed, so there's going to be a future video showing how to thoroughly install that hitch along with trailer wiring. And I'm also going to be doing quite a few towing reviews with this car, towing ATVs. I have plans to get a small 5x8 enclosed aluminum trailer that's around 600-700 pounds empty. So I'm going to be towing that with this car as well. Stay tuned for those videos, guys. Let's go for a drive now, see how the SI suspension feels on the road. Guys, I gotta be honest. It's been like 2 months since I installed this now, and I'm just finally filming the point of view portion of this review. But this rear suspension has totally transformed this Honda Civic Sport trim. Essentially being a base model. I watched a ton of reviews on YouTube of the Civic Si of this generation and the Civic Sport Touring. There's really no other reviews besides mine on YouTube of the Sport 6-speed manual K20C2. Still, one of the ones that stood out to me was Savage Geese, one of my favorite automotive YouTube channels. He complained about the Sport Touring hatchback and whatnot with the 6-speed manual. He really only complained about the handling. It felt like a boat to him. And you know, the soft rear suspension from the factory really does make it a little more washy in the corners. It doesn't give you that firm ride feeling. But just swapping the SI rear suspension on the back of this basically base model Sport has made this car handle so incredibly well. Keep in mind, you know, when I bought this car in 2023, the LX trim didn't come back yet. So this was the base model hatch for around $25,000. And this car came with the 18-inch wheels that are 8 inches wide, and it has 235/40/18 tires. Just to put that into perspective, this car weighs 2,900 pounds, as you saw earlier in the video, and it's got the same width tires on it that the GR Corolla has from the factory. So being that this car is only 2,900 pounds, the GR Corolla is several hundred pounds heavier than that with the all-wheel drive system. This car feels so good, and it's got a lot of rubber on the road to handle very well as a daily driver. You know, the SI comes with the same exact tires as this car now. So changing out the SI rear suspension on this car, leaving the front stock because the SI spring rate is almost identical to the Sport Touring, and all the hatchback, the base model hatchback front end suspension. So there's really no point in swapping out the fronts. There might be different dampening and characteristics and whatnot with the SI, but it's such a minute difference, it wasn't even worth it to me to try to swap out. So I was able to pick up the rear for 180 bucks from a guy selling them because he bought coilovers. So for $180, this car handles probably 90% as well as an SI now. The only reason it's not quite at the SI level is because it doesn't have a limited slip differential up front, and the bushings, as I mentioned earlier, are a little bit softer in this car, a little bit more for comfort, so they will deflect more in the turns than the SI bushings. The SI uses bushings out of the Type R, some of the bushings out of the Type R. But just hitting these turns, this thing has so much less body roll, it rotates so nice, it just feels so planted now, and you don't feel like you're leaning over nearly as much like Savage Geese complained about it being a boat. The only other difference is now as it sits from the SI, obviously, like I mentioned, no limited slip, but the rear sway bar on this car is still stock, but it's a 17.5mm solid bar, and the SI has an 18mm solid bar. So the SI has a 0.5 millimeter bigger diameter rear bar, which is almost negligible at that point. If you're gonna upgrade, don't bother putting an SI rear bar on this. Go with like a Progress, a 22mm or above, depending on how much you want to keep it friendly on the street. But for my situation, you know, I'm not doing a really autocross much with this car. I'm just keeping it a fun, engaging daily driver. I decided to keep the rear stock and see how it felt, and it feels fantastic. And you have the naturally aspirated K20 C2 engine up front, which granted is not as powerful as the SI, but honestly, with the mods I've done, the PRL rear mount and the PRL high volume intake, power isn't really everything. This engine just has more character. It has more soul to the original Honda recipe that the newer 1.5 turbo really doesn't have. This car revs higher than the 1.5 turbo, and let's be honest, neither car is fast in a straight line. So I'll take a little bit slower of a car that actually has a little bit of character over something that's a little quicker that doesn't sound nearly as good. This car doesn't have any fake engine noises piped into the inside of the car because you do have that K20 C2 still, which is a naturally aspirated engine from Honda that sounds pretty decent. But anyway, enough talking about the engine, let's get back to the suspension. But I mean, just side to side, the car is so much more responsive. Feels like you could hit the autocross course pretty good now. And like I said earlier, I do have the Kurt Class 1 hitch installed on this along with all the trailer wiring. That will be released in a video coming up very soon on the channel, so subscribe and stay tuned for that. But the SI suspension helps so much with that, in the fact that if you do hook up a trailer to this car, there is so much less rear end squat. Or if you put two grown adults in the back seats, your car's not going to be looking like a Carolina squatted truck going down the road. It's going to be still pretty flat because you've over doubled the spring rate in the rear. So the more weight you put on the rear, it's going to be more resistive to squatting down and hitting the bump stop. So if you're towing a trailer with an ATV on it, which is what I'm going to be doing, or even a small aluminum enclosed trailer, you can put it on the rear of this car and not have it look like it's struggling. It'll hold the rear end pretty level still, even with a lot of tongue weight on the rear. And by I say a lot, obviously class 1 hitch is under 200 pounds you need to keep for the tongue weight. Being able to tow with this car was another reason I did the suspension swap, in addition to making this car so much more fun to drive. A lot of reviews of the SI online complain about it being a little too harsh for the ride quality. We have some rough roads here in New York, and you know, I'm not on one right now, but I drive through some pretty rough roads to get to work every day. And I could say that I really don't know what they're talking about. Even with the 18-inch wheels and the low profile tires, now that I've made the rear end twice as stiff, the ride quality is still very fantastic. Obviously, you still feel more in the car. You're gonna feel a lot more of the bumps, but nothing rattles more because of the extra stiffness in the rear. It doesn't have any negative side effects for making it feel like a shitbox in here. But the added feedback from the road now you get through the car is so much nicer, to the fact you can feel the characteristics of the road better. For a car that's, you can still get brand new in 2024, I would hop on one of these cars, guys. I mean, I have less than $1,000 in mods so far into this car. Just the intake, the rear engine mount, and the SI rear suspension now. All that comes out to be around like 800 bucks I've invested. So I'm still under $27,000 before tax into this car. So I'm still $2,000 to $3,000 cheaper than buying an SI at MSRP. And this powertrain with the manual, it has been problem-free. It's one of Honda's most reliable engines of all time. The transmission only gets better with time. I will say that it's broken in more. I've got 8,600 miles in the car now. And the transmission, even with the stock shifter bushings, I haven't even considered changing those yet because it just feels so good. So I talked about how the rear sway bar is half a millimeter smaller in diameter compared to the SI, but the front sway bar in this car is noticeably smaller than the SI. And that's actually a good thing, because in a front wheel drive car, you want to go softer on the front end and stiffer in the rear to get that car to tripod and rotate more in the turns. The half millimeter difference in the rear of the SI has the advantage, might be outweighed by the smaller sway bar up front now that we stiffen the rear. Like I said earlier, the alignment didn't change. I literally just bolted the suspension on, and my alignment for 2 months now is the car still drove straight as an arrow. No problems with the steering or anything in the steering system at all. I know a lot of people still post about the sticky steering issue, but I haven't had any of those problems still owning this car almost a year and a half now with 8,600 miles. But yeah, let's wrap up the video here, guys, because I'm probably going to be just repeating myself in my excitement. Like I said, it's been 2 months since I put this on, and I still get joy out of hammering turns and just the way this car handles now compared to the stock form. It's a night and day difference. So this is kind of really a Honda Civic Si hatchback in a way. You don't have the power up front that you used to have from 10 years ago in the K20 Z3s, but the way this car handles, its responsiveness, even still in the stock ECU with the K20 C2 up front, it's really such a good recipe still. And you guys know the news from Honda, this car is going away next year. Honda's eliminating all the manuals from the lineup unless you buy an SI or a Type R, and those cars are only going to get more expensive, and the shortage of manuals is going to continue to increase. So you already know that dealers are going to be asking more markup for the Type R and the SI starting next year. So if you're willing to pay markup and don't care, it's not anything to worry about for you. But someone who wants to get a brand new car, this car is now in the $26,000 range in 2024, and play no games with the dealer, get it for MSRP, do a couple mods to it like I've done, and make it such a great daily driver. Fuel efficient, reliable as hell, and like I said, probably handles 90% as good as an SI right now. All right, guys, so here's one final look at the car. It's absolutely filthy right now, so don't judge me on that. But just a look at the final ride height. Like I said, exactly the same height as stock. And you'll notice back here, the hitch is on now. Like I said, stay tuned, subscribe to the channel. Future videos showing how to install that, as well as the trailer wiring in detail. But you'll also notice one other detail I haven't mentioned yet on the channel is when I did the hitch, I swapped diffusers. I think this diffuser looks much better than the Sport with the fake exhaust tip cutout grill thing that they put on the Sport from the factory. So I did a diffuser swap, which I'll explain more in a future video, so stay tuned for that as well. But thanks guys for watching as always. Leave a comment below. Let me know what you think of the suspension swap, guys. I couldn't be happier with it for the cost and the ease of install. Hopefully this video helps you guys. I truly think this is what Honda should have gave us as a SI hatchback from the factory. It's pretty much perfect now, and for a daily driver with the hitch and towing, I'll go over that more in a future video, but it is such a useful car now. So stay tuned. I'll see you guys in the next one.